Once known as the Jewel of Europe, a city famed for its culture, its art, and its beauty, would be reduced to smouldering ruins in a single night of fire and fury. Thousands of men, women, and children were caught in the inferno, their lives extinguished in the blink of an eye. And even today, the moral debate over this event remains unresolved. Was it a necessary act to defeat the fascist Reich and bring the war to an end, or was it just a monstrous war crime? So, what's the history of the bombing of Dresden? Dresden, the Florence of the Elbe, stood as a cultural gem of Europe. Magnificent Baroque architecture, its art treasures, and its historic churches were symbols of human achievement. But in February 1945, that legacy was on the brink of annihilation. The city had so far been spared the full wrath of World War II, leading many to believe it was untouchable, too beautiful, too refined to face the horrors that had devastated so much of Europe. But Dresden was far from innocent in the war effort. Factories, camouflaged in the city's suburbs, produced armaments and military supplies. Railroads snaked through the city, transporting troops and equipment to the front lines. With the Red Army advancing from the east and the Western Allies from the west, the noose around Nazi Germany was tightening. For Dresden, the end of the war meant not survival, but obliteration. On the night of February the 13th, 1945, Dresden was in the midst of its annual Fasching celebrations, a festival like Mardi Gras. The streets were alive with music, the laughter of children, and the sounds of joy in a war-ravaged world that desperately craved a moment of normalcy. Refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet forces swelled the city's population, seeking shelter from the chaos consuming their homeland. At 10:03 p.m, air raid sirens wailed, but many residents ignored them, desensitized by months of false alarms. The skies above Dresden began to hum with an ominous drone. Hundreds of RAF Lancaster bombers appeared in the night sky, like locusts descending upon an unsuspecting field. The planes dropped their first payload, high-explosive bombs designed to shatter buildings, tear apart infrastructure, and blow open roofs to expose flammable materials inside. The initial explosions ripped through the city's core with violent fury. Entire blocks were disintegrated in a heartbeat. Rail yards, factories, hospitals, and residential neighborhoods were torn apart, reduced to rubble. The sky above Dresden glowed an eerie orange, like a distant volcanic eruption, as fires spread uncontrollably through the shattered streets. But this was only the beginning. The first wave of bombers left Dresden ablaze, but at 1:30 a.m. on February the 14th, a second wave of nearly 500 bombers returned. This time, they carried mostly incendiary bombs, small fist-sized devices designed to ignite anything flammable. The bombs rained down like a demonic firestorm, creating a sea of flames that rapidly engulfed the city. The air above Dresden ignited. Temperatures soared to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to vaporize human flesh. The wind, drawn by the intense heat, began to roar through the streets at hurricane force. The flames leaped from building to building, consuming everything in their path. Windows shattered from the force of the wind, and the firestorm turned the narrow streets of Dresden into vast rivers of flame. People in their homes or shelters could do nothing but pray for an end. Their prayers, however, were unanswered, as the inferno raged on. Families huddled together, shielding their children, as the oxygen in their basements was sucked away by the firestorm. Desperate civilians, their clothes and hair ablaze, fled from their homes and shelters, only to be swept into the vortex of flame that roared through the city. Some fell where they stood, their bodies scorched beyond recognition. Others fled to the bank of the Elbe River, throwing themselves into the water in a futile attempt to escape the flames, only to find the river itself searingly hot. Their skin bubbled and peeled off as they screamed in agony, turning the river into a burning grave. Horrified rescue workers attempted to save as many as they could, but the scene was beyond human comprehension. As dawn broke on February the 14th, the city was barely recognizable. Pillars of black smoke reached high into the sky, and the streets of Dresden, once filled with revelers and families, were now a landscape of death and destruction. But the terror was not over. The American bombers arrived later that morning, targeting Dresden again. In one final act of destruction, they dropped another 800 tons of bombs. The bombs did not fall with the calculated precision of a military target, but indiscriminately, smashing through what little remained of Dresden's already crippled infrastructure. Rescue workers who had survived the night were now targets of a new wave of death, as the American bombs obliterated the few functioning emergency centers left standing. Corpses littered the streets, charred and unrecognizable, fused to the pavement. The survivors were left to wander through the ashes, searching for loved ones they would never find. The smell of burning flesh lingered for days, a constant, sickening reminder of the horror that had been unleashed. In the days and weeks that followed, the true horror of the Dresden bombing began to emerge. The city, swollen with refugees, had housed upwards of 600,000 people at the time of the raid. Conservative estimates place the death toll between 25 and 35,000, but many historians believe the true number of dead could be much higher. Bodies were incinerated beyond recognition, reduced to ash in the firestorm, making an accurate count impossible. Early Nazi propaganda inflated the figure to over 200,000, though this was later discredited. Still, the destruction was absolute, and for many, the bombing was an unforgivable act of cruelty. The bombing of Dresden remains one of the most contentious acts of World War II. Many have argued that the city's destruction was not a military necessity, but rather an act of terror, designed to break German morale and send a clear message to the Soviet Union as the Cold War loomed on the horizon. Dresden, they argued, was no longer a legitimate military target by February 1945. It was a city of refugees, of civilians, a place known for its beauty and culture more than its war industry. For others, the bombing was a necessary evil, a grim but unavoidable part of the total war that Nazi Germany had begun. Dresden had become a key hub for the transport of troops and supplies, and its destruction hastened the end of the war, saving countless lives in the long run. Arthur Harris, head of the RAF Bomber Command, famously justified the bombings with the words, "They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind," referring to the Luftwaffe's earlier bombings of cities like London and Warsaw. But even Churchill, who had once supported the firebombing campaign, began to waver in its aftermath. Albert Speer, Nazi Germany's Minister of Armaments, would later acknowledge that the raid had disrupted war production for only a few weeks, raising further questions about its strategic value. Arthur Harris, however, held a far grimmer perspective. While German factories could be rebuilt in a matter of weeks, it would take 21 years to replace a fallen worker. In the years following the war, Dresden became a symbol of human endurance and the will to rebuild. The city's famed Frauenkirche, reduced to rubble in the raid, was meticulously reconstructed after German reunification, its golden dome now a beacon of hope and reconciliation. The restoration incorporated the largest surviving original structure, a stark reminder of the city's tragic past. The scars of that fateful night remain etched into the collective memory of the survivors, and the debate surrounding the bombing still lingers. Dresden serves as a haunting reminder of the moral dilemmas faced in times of conflict, and of the fine line between military necessity and human atrocity. And though Dresden has risen from its ashes, the ghosts of that firestorm will forever haunt its streets, reminding the world of the terrible price of war.